Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. I'm glad that you're able to find it here. I know it's a little tricky the way we change classrooms. To add to the trickiness, there are microphone problems. So please let me know if I'm not loud enough. Just maybe in the back, raise your hand if I'm not loud enough, and I'll try to pick it up a bit. So today we're talking about the Crucifixion, which is, in any religion, one of the most powerful symbols. And what we're going to be looking at is the commonalities in depictions of the Crucifixion over 2,000 years and what has changed, and to see what remains constant underneath and what evolves and changes in depictions of the Crucifixion and the underlying theology that the Crucifixion shows. So first, just to begin, some background in the theology of the Crucifixion, which sets the stage for what we'll be looking at. The Gospels and the New Testament depict the Crucifixion as central to Christianity and central to the message of Jesus. But it does not say a lot about many specific controversial questions. Jesus himself, throughout the Gospels, says very little about the meaning of his death. He frequently talks about how he expects to be killed, how it's somehow fulfilling the Scriptures, fulfilling God's plan. But there are actually relatively few times in the Gospels when Jesus gives some kind of indication of how or why his crucifixion is going to be important, salvific, a benefit to humanity. Other parts of the New Testament, especially the letters of Paul, will say a lot about the meaning of Christ's crucifixion, why it's important, what it does. But even the other parts of the New Testament can often be open to different interpretations. It's a point at which Christians of different communities often have very serious disagreements about in terms of how to interpret them. So there are many unresolved questions when it comes to the crucifixion. Now, what we're going to do in this short period of time we have is not go into all of the different ins and outs of the theology of the crucifixion, but to let you see how, over time, because I think you will see very clearly over time, how different understandings of the crucifixion have developed and evolved. But before doing that, I'm going to say a little bit, just kind of a starting point, because it really is mysterious when you read the Gospels and you ask yourself, okay, I'm going to keep my eye out for any time in which Jesus says why his crucifixion is important, what it's going to do. You're not going to find many times. It's really kind of mysterious. So as we go through things, first start with just some of those sayings, so just you have them in your mind. Some of the few times when Jesus, he keeps his cards very close to his chest when it comes to the meaning of his death and resurrection. And here are a few times when he reveals something. One is his apostles are arguing among themselves about who the greatest is. And he says, you can't do this. And he says, for the Son of Man, referring to himself, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Ransom, same we mean it now, a price for liberty, for captives. Doesn't say who it paid to, what it is exactly, but his life is going to be a ransom, and that's what he came to do. Another time, he refers to an Old Testament story, when it's one of the most bizarre stories of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, when Moses is in the desert. There are more chairs in the back there if they run out. When Moses is in the desert and the Israelites are bitten by snakes and they start dying. So God tells Moses, make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. And all of the Israelites who've been bitten by snakes, when they look at it, they won't be killed by the poison. So he does it. Very kind of strange story in the Old Testament. And Jesus says in John's Gospel, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. Other points in John's Gospel, lifted up. John says, has something to do with the way that he's going to be killed. And he's going to be lifted up on a cross. Okay, so now you might be saying, so this is all? This is not really much of a big hint of what exactly Jesus' death, how it's going to help. But this is what we have. Another one, and this is actually will be a starting point for next week's lecture on the church, where Jesus says, he's just gone into the Jewish temple, and he's turned things upside down because people are selling things. He doesn't want this going on in the temple. And people are astounded that he would have the boldness to do this and say, give us a sign from God that you have authority to do this. You've just come into the holiest place, you've turned everything upside down. What's your justification? And Jesus speaks in a riddle. He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Puzzling. This is actually one of the sayings that we have strongest reason to think actually goes back to the historical Jesus and something very close to these words. Why? Because in the other Gospels, when they have the trial to put Jesus to death, they're looking for a testimony. And one of the things that the other Gospels say that they got as false testimony was he said he was going to tear down the temple in 2 days or 3 days. They say it also while he's on the cross, you were going to tear down the temple. So there's something about these words that goes back to Jesus. But unlike in those trials, as Jesus didn't say, I'm going to tear down the temple. He says to his enemies, you destroy this temple. So, okay, so he's compared himself to a temple, and he's going to raise it up. That's another important clue. We'll come to that next week. He's a good shepherd who lays down his life. And the hint here is a little buried. It says, a good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Okay, so a good shepherd is really going to try hard, he's going to give his all. But the next sentence tells us a little more what he means. He says, a hired man who is not a shepherd, and whose sheep are not his own, sees a wolf coming, and leaves the sheep, and runs away, and the wolf catches and scatters them. So this laying down his life has to do with giving himself over to the wolf. Letting evil get him. And then, most important, most clear, is in the words of Jesus at the Last Supper, when he takes bread and wine and says, this is my body, this is my blood. Even apart from the exact wording, it's very symbolically clear. If he's connecting the bread and wine to his body and blood, he's somehow saying that his body, his life, is going to be life-giving for his apostles. And furthermore, that he has body and blood as two separate things, suggests that they're going to be separated in some way. The body is going to be separated from the blood. So just by the mere connection of his body and blood to the bread and wine, and the separation indicates somehow his death being life-giving. And then lastly, he says, it will be shed for the forgiveness of sins. This is the only time when he explicitly says anything connecting his death to sin. And, it's often said the most historically certain thing about Jesus was that he was crucified. And I'd like to say that the second most historically certain thing is that he said and did something like this the night before he died. Why? Because immediately after Jesus, in every part where the Christians were, they did this. They did, in memory of him, they took bread and wine and shared it among themselves as his body and blood, remembering what he had said, remembering what happened the next day. Then lastly, and this, for those of you here last week, this will help to explain more about why there were so many images of Jonah, that for the first few centuries, the biggest, most popular scriptural image, by far, is of Jonah. And that's connected to this saying here, when Jesus says that the only sign he's going to give the people of his generation is the sign of Jonah. That just as Jonah was in the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So these are the kind of the clues that can get interpreted in different ways over the centuries. But for our starting point, for the first millennium, this one here is in many ways decisive, and the metaphor, the image that organizes the other images. You know, one of the ways to think about it is in the New Testament, you've got many images and metaphors for talking about the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection. And the question is, how do you order them? Which of the metaphors controls the other metaphors? And for the early Christians, the sign of Jonah is playing a role controlling a lot of the other metaphors, putting them in line, giving them order. And some of the things that, last week we were looking at some of the art that was so clear that came out. One is that the sign of Jonah is understood as a narrative. Remember how for all the other images, they were just one kind of moment in time, maybe two on rare occasions, of different key images from the Old Testament or the New Testament. But Jonah, not only was it the most common image, but it was part of the cycle. Jonah gets thrown into the whale, he gets spit out, and then he's relaxing. And so likewise, this in the sign of Jonah, in the way it affects the early Christians, how they understand things, they see all the moments of Jesus' death and resurrection as all part of what's going on, all of them important. They don't just focus on the moment of crucifixion, they see it within this larger narrative. And obviously there is the crucifixion and the resurrection. For the early Christians, what was also important was the middle part. What's going on between the crucifixion and the resurrection. And one of an image that comes up, it's repeated often, that seems to be kind of an improvisation or a reflection on Jonah, is it talks about Christ going in to the depths of the netherworld and then rescuing the dead, the just, who are trapped, unable to enter heaven, and kind of with them being vomited up out of hell. And they will use an image of a fish representing death or the devil, swallowing a fish hook with a worm on it. The worm is Christ's humanity, the hook is his divinity. It catches the fish and it has to spit out all of its insides. And this isn't just in theological reflections on the crucifixion. Actually, even earlier than that happens, we have the early stories of martyrs, Christian martyrs, who are being killed, and they're described as with this imagery of being swallowed by a fish, the power of death, and then spat out at the end, resurrected. Okay, so this is just the theological background, and as we go through the images, we'll see why the sign of Jonah is so important, that it's a narrative, that it's not just focused on the moment of crucifixion, but it's this whole story that culminates in the resurrection. Now, just a historical note, crucifixion, as we go into this. Crucifixion is, an example of humanity's great inventiveness and cruelty. It originates in Assyria or Babylon, it's thought, and the Persians popularized it in the 6th century. It was developed because it was such a painful way of killing someone. People lasted a long time, anywhere from a few hours to 5 or 6 days. You're put out in public, usually stripped completely naked. You're humiliated. People are watching you suffer. They're deterred from doing whatever you did by knowing that this is a way you could be killed. The actual, so it's popularized by the Persians. Alexander the Great brings it to the Mediterranean after he pushes east. The actual death itself from the cross could come from a variety of things, but generally suffocation was a big one, because being on the cross, the problem is you have to push yourself up to take a breath, and eventually you get too tired, and so you just can't put yourself up, and you die. Sometimes you'll see on depictions of crucifixion a little footrest or even a little seat sometimes, those were actual things, but they weren't to make the crucified person more comfortable. They were to make it so they'd survive longer, so they would suffer longer. In the Gospels, it said that they want to finish things up because they want to get ready for the Sabbath day. So they have the soldiers break the legs of the thieves. And that was because that hastened the death, because they could no longer push themselves up to take a breath. The Emperor Constantine, after he legalized Christianity some years afterwards, he outlaws crucifixion because of its role in Christ's death. And so from that point on, it becomes more of a memory, which also figures into speculations, as we see, because there are not many depictions of the crucifixion for the first few hundred years. And one of the speculations for why is because people were experiencing it. They knew what it was like, and so they were less willing to depict it artistically. Okay, so go down to early images. So what I'm about to show you is the very first image we have that is unmistakably a depiction of the crucifixion of Christ. And it's not done by a Christian. This is a graffiti from the late 100s in Rome. It's very hard to see, but what you have here is a man with an ass's head, crucified, and over here, a man, and the graffiti says, Aleximanus worships his God. So it's a non-Christian making fun of a Christian. That's what the design looks like. So that's the earliest depiction we have of the crucifixion. As you saw in all those catacomb paintings, there was no depiction of the crucifixion. This is one of the very earliest we have. This is a gem, cornelian gem, that was found in Romania, Constanza, about 150 years ago. It's now in the British Museum. And it has a remarkable story of how it got found. There was a Greek woman who ended up, she had a bag of gems which she gave to an archaeologist to examine and possibly sell to the British Museum. As a child growing up in Romania, she was Greek, but she spent a lot of time in Romania. She and her friends would go down to the beach and they'd find lots of gems that dated to the first 2 centuries with designs on the back. And in this bag of gems with many designs, there was one Christian one. And the person she saw knew the value, bought it, and it's now in the British Museum. And here is Christ, and on each side, 6 men, the apostles, on either side. And you'll notice, he looks very much alive, he's in control, he doesn't look like he's in any kind of pain. This is going to be a theme as we go forward. This is another early gem that was discovered, I think, only in the 1960s. This one's a little different. This, in the early centuries, there were a custom of magical gems that various Hellenistic religions, or possibly some Christians would have, that have incantations on them, kind of magical amulets. And this one is often called a gem like that, although whether or not it's not exactly its function, it's not clear. But there's an image of Christ on the cross, and written in Greek, and it's also on the back as well, are prayers to Christ. It's something like, O Son, O Father, O Jesus. And it refers to the cross as well, and his name, Emmanuel. So some kind of prayer written in on the gem, which may or may not have been seen to have some kind of magical or protective power. Now here, this is a theory being floated of what could actually be even earlier. These are, I think, 200s, maybe late 100s. I don't think so. Somewhere in there, but very early, first few centuries. This is a Christian manuscript, and there is a custom even before Christianity comes along. In Greek script, you could abbreviate letters by putting them together. And even before, and there are many different letters that you can kind of combine in different ways. And before Christianity, there was already a way that you combine a tau, a Greek letter like a T, and a rho, like a P. So that is a T and a rho put together. And that was already a standard abbreviation. It's different from the Chi-Rho. And it's used in Christian manuscripts for the word crucify. When the word crucify appears in many manuscripts, this abbreviation will be used, even though the tau and the rho are a few letters apart from each other in the Greek word for crucify, or cross. And so it's argued by many scholars that this actually might be the earliest visual depiction of the cross, because if you look at it, it looks like a man on a cross, kind of a stick figure. So a kind of letter that could be an early depiction of the crucifix. And in any case, we know that that image, it's called a staurogram, stauro from the word for cross or crucify, that was used, meaning referring to the cross in some way later. It's just a question of, was this seen originally in this script as a visual depiction of the crucifixion, as a way that when that word would pop up, it would be kind of honored, as though suggesting that there was something that Christians were honoring about the crucifixion when they came across it. Last week, we had our friends the Orants praying like this. Well, another reason why it seems that the early Christians found that prayer image and that posture so fitting for prayer is because they saw it as representing the cross, Jesus crucified. There's also a story in the Old Testament when Moses, there's a battle, the Israelites are battling another army, and God tells him, keep up your arms. As long as you keep your arms raised, the Israelites will win. And so the battle's going all day. Moses starts to drop his arms. The Israelites start to lose. So eventually he has to have two people holding up his arms. So the early Christians, of course, read that story, and they saw it as, this is the crucifixion. Christ having his arms out is saving, and so that figures into that prayer posture. And so that Orant might also be symbolically referencing the crucifixion. But regardless of those early ones, which are kind of debated, and you can argue different ways, we have no access to get inside the minds of the people who did those images. But in the early 400s, starting around 420, we have definite, unmistakable, large images of Jesus on the cross. So this one is from a series of 4 ivory panels that are on a smallish ivory casket. They're held in the British Museum. And you see that there's multiple stories here. There's Jesus with the cross, the tomb, the crucifixion. Notice Judas is here too. He's just hung himself. So here you have John and Mary over here. Over here you have a soldier who stabs Jesus to make sure he's dead in the Gospels. Although here he's stabbing him, although Jesus is alive in the picture. A lot of the details will get collapsed in depictions. And then here's Judas, who's hung himself out of guilt with the money bag of the 30 pieces of silver he got for betraying Christ. Now, first of all, a number of things to kind of just notice. This is the first kind of major artistic depiction we have. Jesus does not seem to be too troubled about his situation. He's got a very bold, triumphant kind of look. He is in charge of the situation. He's not sagging. You don't feel any weight of his body. He's somebody who is a victor in this. He's not suffering. And also, this is in part of a narrative. This is not just one moment. This is part of a narrative. And in this one scene, you've got a lot of stories. You've got Judas, you've got John and Mary, you've got, who are at the foot of the cross, and the soldier stabbing his side. here is the next depiction of the Crucifixion, just 10 years later, also in Rome. These are the doors of Santa Sabina, one of the oldest basilicas in Rome. And you'll see there are many panels of different stories from the life of Christ. And up here, in this upper little corner, you can barely see it. These are very high doors. There's this, Crucifixion. Jesus in the middle, with the two thieves on either side, not to life size. They're smaller, they're not as important. The focus is on Jesus in the middle. And again, number one, this is part of, it's in the context of telling a story. Jesus does not seem particularly suffering in this moment. He's in control. He's even just kind of even standing on the ground. Oh, incidentally, so here's, you kind of say, where's the cross? And there's, in terms of what the cross would have actually been like, first of all, it's very unlikely that Jesus would have been nailed to, a cross like that, and then hoisted up. There would likely have been some kind of poles or some other kind that was already there, and then Jesus would have been hoisted up with the crossbeam. And that's what Jesus would have carried. There's no way somebody being crucified would have carried the whole, both parts of it. They would just carry the crossbeam. And there's a possibility that the cross was just like this, a T, or it could have been like a plus sign. Both were used. And here you kind of see a variety of ways in which the different individuals are crucified. Okay, so we don't have much from these early years. And so why? Why is it that we don't have more images of the crucifixion? And this is something that is puzzling, especially because of how important the crucifixion is in the New Testament and the Gospels, and certainly in later Christian art. So why do you have to go so far before you find these artistic depictions of crucifixion? There are all those images in the catacombs we have, but we don't have a single crucifix. Why? One theory that's now less plausible because of those gems which have emerged is that the crucifixion wasn't that important to the early Christians. That it was only later that, as things developed, the crucifixion started to become more central to the Christian imagination. But in light of those gems, those depictions on the manuscripts, that's much less plausible. And furthermore, the way that these images appear on the doors of Santa Sabina or in the ivory casket, there doesn't seem to be anything special about them. They're just people telling the story. And they're not crossing any line when they come to tell the story of the crucifixion. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. That the one also concern is that the crucifixion was such a horrible way to die that it would have been unfitting to depict Christ on it. So that was another commentary. But the fact that we have these early ones, they appear, there's nothing. It doesn't seem to be anything dramatic about them. You look at these doors, at the upper left corner. People don't seem to have any trouble depicting them. And especially when you see those gems, where especially the magical gem, as it's called, that people saw the crucifix, the image of the crucifixion, as somehow powerful, visually and spiritually. So this is a matter of debate. My own view is that the reason why we don't have more of the crucifixions is because there was not one focus on the moment. For the early Christians, what was much more vividly in their minds in terms of the here and now was Christ's resurrection, that Christ was alive. The early Christians, would say, Christ is risen, hallelujah. It was a common liturgical refrain. That was what their focus was on the resurrection. The crucifixion was an important part of the story. Just as Jonah can't enjoy his good fortune until he's been swallowed by the whale and then spat out. So the crucifixion was central. It was seen as part of the mysteries, but their focus was on the living Christ, the resurrected Christ, and the crucifixion, when it came to artistic depictions, was first emerging in a narrative context of telling that story of how you get to the resurrection. Because if they're not going to be telling a story somewhere where you end up putting in the crucifixion, the focus is going to be more on the living Christ, or those images from the Old Testament, where somehow representing Christ overcoming death, or Daniel in the lion's den, Noah coming out of the ark. So, moving ahead to some of these early images, this is from a column in San Marco in Venice. It dates to, San Marco has a lot of Byzantine art in it, Venice being a trading capital with so many connections to the east. And this column dates to the 6th century. But here, it's not quite a crucifixion. You've got the two thieves on either side, but in the middle, instead of Christ crucified, you have a lamb, making the cross a kind of sign of triumph. So this is a manuscript from the 6th century, I think originally from Syria. And here we have, I think the earliest color image of the crucifixion, or certainly one of the earliest colored images of the crucifixion. And here you have in this image a lot of things that will reappear in later images of the crucifixion. First of all, you've got two figures on either side. One, the soldier with the spear, who in the Gospels only stabs Jesus after he's already dead. But here, often Jesus is still alive. Over here, you've got the sponge bearer, who has sponge dipped in myrrh, kind of a painkiller that he offers to Jesus on a sponge. And then you have soldiers casting lots for Jesus' clothing. You have the women weeping for Jesus, and John and Mary. Jesus, you notice, is wearing this kind of long tunic, colobium, which is kind of just a normal Roman tunic, which also then took on use in Christian liturgies, a priestly garment. So Jesus is being depicted as a priest on the cross, and the color is purple, the color of royalty. So he's wearing a kind of royal liturgical garment on the cross. So a lot of loaded meaning is being put into the depiction, going beyond anything in the story of the Gospels. And also, just to draw your attention again, that this story of the crucifixion is not self-standing. Not only is it not just Jesus on the cross, you have all those other bits of the story up there, but you also have down here the resurrection. And we'll see here, this will be a common depiction of the tomb, this kind of little building. Now, as a matter of fact, we know that the kind of tomb Jesus would have been in would just been kind of a cave carved into a wall. Actually, where he was buried was an abandoned stone quarry in Jerusalem. So, and it would have just been, kind of a cave almost carved out from a wall. But this is the way it will typically be depicted. There are the angels telling the women, he's risen. Here's the risen Christ appearing to the women who come to the tomb. The soldier, who spent a guard, overcome by Jesus' resurrection. Here's slightly later. If that's 6th century, this is 8th century. This is a fresco in a Roman church, Santa Maria Antiqua. And so you have, the other one is Syria. This is Rome. Very similar depiction of Christ on a cross with this liturgical royal garment. Again, perfectly in control, perfectly at peace. You have Mary and John. there at the feet. Good. Why Mary and John is because some of his last words are, he says to Mary, behold your son, and to John, behold your mother. And in this way, in the story, Jesus is taking care of his mother, who has no other children to look after her. And it's also read in the way John tells the story, that this is symbolic of Mary and representing the church, and inviting the person reading the story to be seen as being brought into the family of Christ. And so, likewise, so when you have those depictions, it's both the story, but it's also a way in which the viewer, who's presumed to be Christian, is being brought into the story as having a place in it. This is another similar image. This is an icon that is in the monastery of St. Catherine's in Mount Sinai. Very similar kind of depiction of Christ again. Okay. So now we're going to move to the focusing on Western depictions of the Crucifixion, starting around the 700s. So a lot of our depictions are from manuscripts, where you have this similar kind of pose of Christ, awake, not straining under the weight of the body, a very straightforward depiction of him. Up here, you have some images that will start to appear, a lot of the sun and the moon, representing the heavenly powers, also representing the way in the Gospels when Jesus is crucified, there's an eclipse, the sun won't shed its light. So more of these depictions. And Mary and John on either side. You also have a number of ivory book covers that are carved with the same basic images there, the sun and the moon. And the four people on either side are going to be the spear bearer, the sponge bearer, and Mary and John. Now here, in addition to Mary, John, two angels, the sun and the moon, you've got some other things here. You've got the tomb at the bottom. You have a snake on the cross, representing the devil being overcome. You have other tombs being opened. In Matthew's Gospel, it says that when Christ was crucified, the tombs opened and some of the dead came out of them. And over here, we've got a new figure that we haven't seen yet. And this is a woman, often thought to represent the church, catching blood from Christ's side. And this is connected to what will later develop in the legend of the Holy Grail in medieval England. Initially, the Grail is just a magical kind of bowl, that has healing powers or other things. That has nothing to do with the Last Supper or the chalice. But then in the High Middle Ages, the Arthurian legend of the Grail gets combined with this kind of legendary catching of the blood in a chalice. And all gets put together so that the chalice that Christ uses at the Last Supper and says, "This is my blood," is the same chalice that's used the next day to catch blood from his side. And then gets caught up and is part of the Arthurian legend of the Grail. Now, this brings also to this blood and water coming from Christ's side, which becomes increasingly important in a lot of depictions of the crucifixion. So this goes to, after Christ is crucified, to make sure, and he's died, they want to wrap things up to get ready for the Sabbath. And so they break the legs of the other thieves who are crucified with him. And then they check. He looks dead. They want to check. So the soldier, depicted here, often given a name, Longinus, and who's ends up being converted as a result of it in the legends. And blood and water comes from his side. Now, this is depicted as just as part of the story, but it's also early on taken to have symbolic significance. First of all, the early Christians think back to the Garden of Eden and the creation of Eve from Adam's side. That God opens up Adam's side, he takes a rib, and then from that rib fashions Eve. Well, the early Christians saw from Christ's side, from this blood and water, the church is being established. The bride of Christ is coming forth. And the blood and water is understood to refer to the rituals of baptism and the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, together, because seeing those as, in a sense, the foundational rituals of the church. So here's another depiction of very similar images. Once you get used to it, you can if you were carving these plaques, you kind of knew you had to put certain things in them. So you have the sun and the moon. You've got Longinus, the sponge bearer, Mary, John, the snake, and then the crucifixion. The resurrection at the bottom. Still, it's not just a focus exclusively on the crucifixion. It's the whole story, of which the crucifixion is a critical part. Here's another one. This is a German one from around 1000, with the kind of essential characters there. Now here, you have, instead of the resurrection, you have Christ being laid in the tomb at the bottom. But pay attention. See, as in these images we've been looking at, Christ is awake. He's alive. It's not a dead Christ on the cross. It's a living Christ. And that's what we've been seeing all throughout what we've been looking at. A living Christ. This is a famous crucifix given by King and Queen of one of the Spanish nations around 1000, I think, to the Archbishop of Leon. Or not Leon, Leon. And so here you have Christ with a kind of, expression filled with a kind of pathos, but not pain. Eyes wide open with a jet black stone. And it's hard to see, but there's very intricate carving. It's not just, kind of geometric designs. First, at the very bottom, and we'll see this a lot, there's Adam, whose sin brought sin into the world. So one of the main beneficiaries of the crucifixion is Adam there at the bottom. There are many legends that, interpreting, there are a lot of things that develop as people reflect on little clues, and then elaborate stories get developed. So one, Jesus is crucified at Golgotha, which means place of the skull. Now, presumably it's because the rock formation looked like a skull. But people start to develop the idea, it's called the place of the skull because Adam was buried there. And his skull is underneath the cross. And so when Adam is depicted underneath the cross, this is also with a reference to a spatial legend, that his body was underneath where the cross was, thus poetically reversing his sin. And then up the side, these are actually people coming up the side out of tombs. And they're kind of bunched at the bottom, and then they get increasingly more space between them as they get up. to heaven. And here's the resurrected Christ holding a cross, a sign of victory. And way above, you can barely see it, a bird representing the Holy Spirit. And the back is more elaborate, a carving on the back. Another way, a lot of these depictions are in these cloisonné colored enamels. And here, again, we've got the sun and the moon, Mary and John. Around this time, the spear bearer and the sponge bearer start to drop out. They become less commonly shown. And here now is another theme within depictions of the Crucifixion. Not that common, but significant. And this is the depiction of the cross as the tree of life. So another thing the early Christians look back to, and they say, okay, in the Garden of Eden, you had two trees. You had a tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree Adam and Eve weren't supposed to eat of, and which led to death. And then the tree of life, which they didn't get a chance to eat from because they chose the wrong tree. So here, the early Christians thought of the tree of life as a foreshadowing of the cross. A wooden tree on which life hangs, and from whom the fruit of the tree of life, the Eucharist, comes. So here you have the cross being depicted as the center of this huge tree with these vines, all this growth. The birds of the air are coming to dwell in it. Mary and John are there. Up here you can see a hand. You start to see this around now. A hand, the Father's hand, in blessing and approval. This is a mosaic from the church in Rome, San Clemente, to date to around 1100. And just quickly looking at a few more. We're now 1000, 1100, 1200, and you continue to have these very kind of peaceful, non-suffering Christ on the cross. Here there's almost a smile on his face. These are around 1100, and the famous San Diego crucifix connected with St. Francis of Assisi. Again, very peaceful, no weight of the body at all. And that's all going to change, or actually did change a bit before. And but we'll take a break here and resume 10 minutes or so. Okay, so I'm going to start again. So the fans were kind of, I was here to make it difficult for people to hear. So I'm going to turn off the fan. If it gets too hot, we can always turn it on, or just if you just want to go, if you're just boiling, just go up and turn it off. And if at any point you can't hear me, just raise your hand, and I'll signal to speak louder. Now, we're not going to have time to go through a lot, but one of the reasons why I gave you this list is so that you can, if you Google some of these names I put here, the artist's name, or some of these places, and crucifix or crucifixion, you'll see these images. But one of the things to have most important is just how things evolve. Now that you've gotten a lot of the basic elements that you'll see of what's represented, we can go a little quicker. And the thing I want to underline is, up to this point, we have been looking at triumphant images of Christ, often called Christus Victor. Victorious Christ. You see somebody divine who's not very troubled by what he experienced, without any questioning of his divinity. That starts to shift in emphasis. So in the Byzantine East, centered in Constantinople, we start to have developments. So far, this is what we've been seeing before. But then, so there's a shift. So first of all, notice, okay, this is a gold engraving from San Marco in Venice again. There's a beautiful gold pall that covers part of the altar. And some parts of it are different, were done at different times and added. And this was some gold and gems done by Byzantine artists from Constantinople in the east. And the same images we've seen, but here's a big difference, is we're starting to see Christ feeling pulled by the weight of his body. And you also see that he's kind of turned. And we're going to see this more and more, his body starts to take an S shape. And there is speculation, again, it starts to happen, we have any written explanation of why, but it could have to do with that passage when Jesus says, just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so will the Son of Man be lifted up. And so what's a serpent? Like an S. So what would an S be like on a snake being lifted up? So Jesus' body is being more like that serpent. It's impossible to know, but that's one speculation for why that starts to happen. And in any case, regardless of if there's any symbolic connection to that story, that S shape will kind of give you a sense of pathos and suffering, of this is not the same triumphant Christ that we were seeing before. Also, the blood, you see, before, it's kind of a spurt. Now it's kind of like a projectile. And there was a lot of theological reflection on this. Some who even speculated that the Holy Spirit kept the blood pumping in Christ's dead body. This was a kind of a theory popular among some Byzantine Eastern theologians, which the Latin West didn't care for. But you'll start to see that kind of shooting out. So here's a Byzantine ivory. We're starting to look at Christ. He's more kind of weighed down by the cross. Also underneath, we've got a new symbol here. This is Hades, the underworld. And so he's being impaled by the cross and forced to let go of his dead. These are mosaics in Byzantine churches. And now you see Christ's eyes are closing. Is he alive? Is he dead? It's now a question. Here's another one. This one, let's see, is the eyes closed? Kind of barely open. But that, blood and water is coming out in that kind of graceful little jet. There's the skull from Adam. And here are icons. Now these are all kind of moving up through, there's not much change. We're spanning about 500 years as we go through these. So that curve is becoming more pronounced. It's starting more stylized. So, it's definitely now settled on a kind of a way of doing things. This is taking us, that's 600 years of covering of Byzantine depictions of the Crucifixion. Okay, so that's the Byzantine East. Now let's go over and see what the West is doing. So, around the same time that, maybe a little later, as that Byzantine emphasis of the weight of the body, the suffering is starting to develop, something is brewing in the West. This is a Psalter from the Netherlands, in Utrecht, called the Utrecht Psalter, meaning that it has the 150 psalms, the song hymns of the Old Testament. And it's illustrated. It's beautiful calligraphy and beautiful illustrations. One of the most important illuminated manuscripts of the first millennium. And here, there's Crucifixion. And some scholars think, it's hard to tell when you look at it, but some think that the Christ on the cross is dead. And if so, this is the first depiction of Christ dead on the cross in the West. And I think this is around 800. And then here, the most significant kind of work of art that shows a dead Christ. This is around 980 AD. This is a wooden crucifix that the Archbishop of Cologne commissioned to be at his tomb, and it got brought into, it's still hanging in the cathedral in Cologne. And here, dramatic departure from the crucifixes we've been seeing thus far. It is, and here's a close-up of the eyes. It is, a very naturalistic cross. The body is very heavy on the cross. It's very different from those triumphant images of the cross that we saw earlier. Here's an Anglo-Saxon reliquary from 1000, maybe 1100, where also you have a dead cross. That's an ivory corpus on top of German gold metalwork on the back. Now, I'm going to skip, I'm not going to go through this too much, but St. Anselm, right around this time, around 1100, proposes a way of understanding redemption, where Christ's crucifixion is a kind of an act of heroic beauty and self-giving that kind of changes the balance. That sin had created this kind of big hole in things, and Christ's cross changes that and rebalances things. It's not that Christ, according to Anselm, is being punished for what humans did, but that it's this beautiful act of generosity which, kind of just balances the scales and then some of the canceling the ugliness of sin, and from that ugliness drawing something beauty which pays off a debt. And that theory, which it's an open question. How much is St. Anselm in that way of talking about redemption? How much is he developing ideas that are already there? I mean, that this cross had already been around 150 years when St. Anselm proposes his understanding of redemption. So how much has already there's been an increased focus on the suffering of Christ and it in itself somehow compensating. But whatever the case is, St. Anselm, whether he's the kind of the spark or he's kind of the expression of a growing movement, after St. Anselm, there is an increased focus on the suffering of the cross. Apart from the resurrection, apart from the rest of the story, but just the moment of the crucifixion as something that is balancing things out. I realize the fan is over here. I'm going to turn this off. Now, there's never been, St. Anselm's approach was never universally accepted. Right after Anselm, still in his living memory, Peter Abelard, who overlapped with him a little bit lifetime-wise, although Anselm was dead by the time Abelard was really active. Abelard is aware of Anselm, and he criticizes Anselm. And his argument is, why would God want the death of his son? And it would mean that God set the price of our salvation as the son's death. Like, why would he want it? And then he pays it himself. And he also points out in the Gospels, Jesus is forgiving sins before his crucifixion. So he raises, how does Anselm's understanding of redemption work? And he proposes instead that Christ's crucifixion saves us because it inspires people who look upon the cross or think about Christ's crucifixion to selfless love. And not so much because then that leads people to do good things which saves them, but because that inspiration opens them to the Holy Spirit. And then the Holy Spirit in them is what saves them. But these two figures play a pivotal role in giving theological reasons to focus on the moment of crucifixion, apart from the narrative, and to focus on the crucifixion itself, apart from everything else, which saves. For Anselm, because it's compensating for the ugliness of sin. For Abelard, because Christ's example then opens people to the Holy Spirit. So when you look at images, you start to see an increased depiction of suffering. Now, this is a dead Christ. Another similar one. And that's Hades at the bottom, being pierced by the cross. being forced to give up souls and dead. Sometimes it can be hard to tell whether it's Adam or the netherworld. And the way you can tell is if somebody's being jabbed in the stomach. Now, we're moving to Italian painters, 1200s. And this might look familiar. It should look like those Byzantine crucifixes we saw. That basic curve, the kind of combination of naturalism and stylizing is there. This is Pisano, and then Cimabue. This is also Cimabue, but a very different kind of style, more less Byzantine in the way it looks. And then something happens. This is Giotto, who's overlaps a bit lifespan with Cimabue. Cimabue, according to legend, was Giotto's teacher. So here, we were just going through, okay, Byzantine, kind of Byzantine, Renaissance. And this is a big break, a change, where you're on this trajectory of emphasizing the suffering, but with Giotto, around Giotto, in the painted images, the Crucifixion, we start to have a more naturalized depiction, three-dimensional, lifelike, in a way that we associate with the Renaissance. Here's his depiction of the Crucifixion from the Arena Chapel in Padua near Venice. And here you've got, although Giotto is still, working out three-dimensionality, people are just kind of stacked on top of each other. They haven't really figured out how you do depth in crowds. But there's a change. And people were aware of it at the time. Giotto, everybody wanted Giotto to paint things for them. They knew he was different. Something was going on. Underneath, by the way, that's Adam's skull. You can kind of peek through. So the same basic iconography, same basic symbols, they're all there, but they're now being kind of put together in a different way. But we start to see more and more of Mary Magdalene at the cross, weeping, present. Now, one of the things of where does Giotto get this from? Well, it seems that this move comes because the Byzantines aren't doing it. Where's Giotto getting it from? Well, it seems it's coming from Gothic sculpture. This move is coming from the sculpture. So look at these depictions. They're all done by the same artist, different pulpits in Italy of the Crucifixion. I mean, if it would not be shocking to hear that they were done in the 1400s or 1500s, but actually those were done in the 1200s by the same guy who painted this. So he's painting this way, but when he sculpts this. And this would be an area where the West would be more likely to innovate because of a long story of in the Byzantine East, Christians thinking that images of the saints and Christ should not be displayed and being destroyed, and then they're saying, okay, it's okay. But one thing they didn't go back to was sculpture. They kept it to 2 dimensions because sculpture was too risky. It was too close to idol worship. But the West didn't have a problem with that. And they also didn't have any models. So they were kind of free to develop it on their own. And so that move is brought into eventually painting, but still with this shift towards showing the suffering Christ. Now we're going to the north. This is Van Eyck, 1300s, early northern, associated with the Renaissance. And the Crucifixion is coupled with a Last Judgment scene. And one of the things that's striking about it, you can't see it in too much detail, but in keeping with the Dutch tradition, it's very detailed, very beautifully painted, but also very realistic. There's no halos on anybody's head. It's just meant to kind of show the story of the Crucifixion in its kind of brutal realism. This is Van der Weyden, who's contemporary Van Eyck, but who's kind of in between. on the one hand, he is kind of moving in that direction. Here we have got a dead Christ. Same kind of naturalism that's developing. But at the same time, you've got angels. Van Eyck had no angels. Around this time, there's kind of this stylized thing with Jesus' loincloth, where it kind of floats in the air. And it's not clear where it comes from, but it seems to be kind of as though it's like a banner, a victory banner of some kind. And it also serves an artistic purpose, is that it can kind of balance things out with that extra material. What's that?
The previous one, how long did I call the face on the right hand side?
This one here?
Next one, on the right.
Okay. So this is Veronica, the legend of Veronica, which literally means true image. That as Jesus is carrying his cross, he falls, and a woman comes up to wipe his face and leaves his face, an image of his face on the cross, on the cloth, and so she will appear often.
What about the one on the left?
I think that's Mary Magdalene, because I think that might be ointment for the body. But that's a guess. So here's another Van der Weyden. So naturalistic, but not as kind of gritty as that Van Eyck. It's another Van der Weyden. But we're starting to see something. Look at kind of all these drops of blood. Now, I was going to go quickly through a bunch of woodcuts. Look how bloody they are. 1300s, 1400s. Now, some of them, it started to appear that they're called, in German, I think, Pestkreuz, meaning plague crosses, where Jesus is shown suffering from plague on the cross. Totally, beyond the story of the Gospels. But, connecting Jesus' suffering with what people were suffering at the time. So, and all this is, this suddenly has come relatively quickly as this focus on the suffering of Christ develops. Now, this is all, developing, I should say, we looked at some of those, there's kind of an overlap period where for a couple hundred years, you've got some crucifixes that are showing Christ triumphant, awake, alive. And then at the same time, there's others are showing him suffering, and they're becoming bloodier. And there's a kind of an overlap of styles. And so here, we're focusing on this bloody kind of trajectory, 1300s, 1400s. This is a cross in Cologne. Another. So this is early 1500s by Grunewald. And in many ways, the next one I'll show you in particular is the apotheosis of this kind of style. This is the famous Isenheim Altarpiece, which was done around 1515. And the context is really important. It's close in. So this is, as was common in a lot of medieval churches and even Baroque churches, you'd have an altarpiece of many different images, and you could fold them out. And you'd have, so the outer image here is the Crucifixion. But for Easter, you open it up, and there's a resurrection. For Christmas, you open it up, and there's the birth of Christ. So depending on the feast day, you had different images. And this is quite big. I mean, this is something like this. And so here's the cross and Christ, in the tomb. Now this was commissioned for a particular kind of hospital. From those who suffered from what was called St. Anthony's fire. It was a skin disease, which was very painful, and it was very common. We now know it's something to do with some kind of bacteria or virus or something in barley. But people then didn't know it. They just, once they got it, and it could now today be easily treated, but then there wasn't much that could be done. And a whole religious order started just to take care of people with this problem. And so Grunewald was commissioned to do this for the chapel of this hospital, for people who suffered from St. Anthony's fire, it was called. And if you look closely, you see that Christ's skin has a kind of affliction on it. And that was the typical of what your skin would look like if you had St. Anthony's fire. So in this image, so first of all, you have Christ, extra, more than life size, dominating the picture. It's realistic, but it's more than realistic. It's kind of grotesque. It's exaggerated to convey the suffering. And it's not just Christ, but also others in their contorted bodies. The first here's depictions of his hands and his feet. Over here, this is Mary, his mother, with John, who's got an impossibly long arm, and then Mary Magdalene. And notice, they're kind of their hands kind of all echo each other. And over on the other side is John the Baptist. I mean, John the Baptist in the Gospel's already dead, but he's there, and the words are, behold the Lamb of God. And there's the little lamb as well. Now, to fully understand what Grunewald is doing, you have to get to the inside. So after you go through the Crucifix, Easter, and Christmas, this is the inner one. There's a wooden sculpture in the back. Somebody other than Grunewald did. The bottom, there's the Last Supper. And here are depictions of St. Anthony. St. Anthony was one of the first monks. He's called the father of monasticism because he went off to the desert in Egypt and lived there remotely. And here the story, he was tempted in the desert. And so here is an imaginative depiction of St. Anthony being tempted in the desert. And there, on this little scroll, are these words: "Where were you, Jesus? Why were you not there to heal my wounds?" So now imagine you live in this hospital. You have St. Anthony's fire. And you go to the chapel, and you see Christ on the cross with the same affliction you have. And then, when it's opened, you go in there, and there's St. Anthony being tormented with that question. No answer, just that question. So here, in this, with the Isenheim Altarpiece, which is, widely regarded as one of the most, impressive, beautiful is kind of a strange word to apply to it, but it is just amazing. And it's kind of the pinnacle of this kind of approach to the crucifixion, where it's emphasizing the suffering, but in a way that is not just about kind of making it as bloody as possible, but as allowing the person looking at it to find, some kind of identification with Christ on the cross. Okay. Now, so now we're into the Renaissance. So now we're actually backing up. Isenheim, that's 1500s, because I wanted to show you how that trajectory kind of ends. But in the early 1400s, actually this is 1300s, early 1400s, another trajectory is going. So people who are committed to doing more on the line of Giotto, that are committed to doing the realism, the naturalism, emphasizing more of the suffering, the humanity of Christ, but aren't going in that other direction. Michelangelo was very aware of that, and he was very consciously rejecting it. He thought it was too much. We have he wasn't unusual in this. We know, for example, there was the Bishop of Verona who forbade people to have excessively bloody images of the crucifixion in 1400s, 1500s in his in his diocese. So here is, this is regarded as not just an important image of the Crucifixion, but just a pivotal work of the Renaissance by Masaccio, this kind of, tragic figure. He dies 27, and in a handful of frescoes that he left in Florence, he revolutionized and opened up new possibilities for art. Michelangelo and others would go and look at his frescoes to get ideas. And here, this is, I think, his one crucifixion. He's depicting the crucifixion as a Trinitarian event. So here's God the Father in the back, the Holy Spirit in the middle, you can barely see it, and there's Christ on the cross. Now, God the Father is holding up the cross. So here you've got the suffering Christ, but there's no sense of God the Father, in a sense, wanting Jesus to suffer. He's kind of offering the Son, look at my Son. Here, one of the Mary kind of looking out the viewer, pointing as well. And it's almost as though God the Father is helping his Son as he suffers, as opposed to pouring out his wrath. And this imagery was not unique to Masaccio. There are others, same kind of imagery, often called the seat of mercy. Notice here, God the Father looks like Jesus. And that's because Jesus is the image of the Father. So a lot of traditions will depict the Father as though it's Jesus' twin. So now, we're also in Florence. Florence is where kind of like an artistic nuclear bomb went off in the early 1400s. And this is another big part of it. Fra Angelico, a Dominican, like myself, member of the Dominican order. And here, there's a trend within this period of you add various historical people to the picture who don't belong. And here it's St. Dominic. And Christ is looking down. It's a suffering pose, but he's got a peaceful, he's actually kind of smiling down at St. Dominic. It's another similar one. I'm going to go a little quicker here, just give you a sense of Fra Angelico, that there's the suffering, but there's a kind of peacefulness to it. It was a common theme of in San Marco, it's now converted into a museum. And he was brought in to paint all the individual rooms of the brothers living there. And in most of the cells, there are a variety of different New Testament images in the different cells. He'd paint a different image in each room. But probably 30% of them are crucifixes, because that was seen as, and that gives you a sense of the place of the crucifixion in people's imagination in that time, very different from 1,000 years before. This is Donatello sculpture of the crucifix, done in the early 1400s. After he finished this, Donatello brought his friend Brunelleschi over. And he says, Brunelleschi, what do you think? This is a story related to us by Giorgio Vasari in his Lives of the Artists. And Brunelleschi at first just smiles, he won't answer. And Donatello says, no, really, what do you think? And Brunelleschi says, well, you've depicted a peasant. Christ wasn't a peasant, he was more noble. And Donatello is angry, he says, well, you try it. So he did. And Donatello said, okay, you're right. I paint peasants, you paint Christ, or sculpt. And the difference is, because here's a kind of more muscular, kind of somebody out in the fields, and this is a more kind of refined, elegant body. But that story tells you that how much they're thinking of, yes, they're depicting a suffering Christ, they're depicting a dead Christ, but they have in mind they're not trying to depict like a horrifying image of blood. This is another Renaissance artist, Montaigne. Just to give you, so they're kind of moving in that trajectory. This is Michelangelo's crucifix, done when he's younger. Very much in kind of the model of Donatello and Brunelleschi. And as I said, he objected to excessively bloody crucifix. He saw that it was supposed to He thought there was supposed to be something beautiful about Christ. This is Fra Lippi. No, Botticelli. It's Botticelli. Raphael. These are sketches of Michelangelo. This one is later in his life. It has Christ looking off to the Father. So again, you see, looking through these Renaissance depictions, there's a sense of realism, of suffering, but also in a different way, a kind of Christos Victor about it. So sometimes people talk about these Renaissance depictions as combining the Christos Victor with that suffering Christ. Okay, so this is Lucas Cranach, perhaps one of the most important artists of the Lutheran Reformation. Cranach had a kind of successful artistic career. This was done around 1502, and he lived in the same town as Martin Luther. And he became friends, was a very close associate with Martin Luther, and they spoke a lot about art, how its role in Reformed Christianity. And so this is, an earlier image, so before Cranach has any kind of Reformed ideas of Christianity. You can see that probably very much in that trajectory of the emphasis on the suffering, the blood. And incidentally, there's a kind of a multiple, that emphasis could have multiple objectives. It could be to emphasize, to draw more compassion for Christ. It could also be intended to invoke a kind of fear of, this is God's judgment of sin. Watch out. This is Lucas Cranach almost 30 years later, after he and Luther kind of worked out an understanding of what is the place of religious art within Reformed theology. Now, for other Reformed traditions, Zwingli, Calvin, those following them, there was no place for any kind of religious image. Luther had kind of a middle way. Say, at first he was more neutral, he's like there's nothing wrong, but then he actually became more positive as he saw images being rejected by others, and became more convinced that they were important. But he had a very particular sense of what its role should be, again, which he worked out in many ways with Cranach. And one of them was he thought that they should be emphasizing teaching. So here, actually, there are words. This is the centurion saying, truly, this was the Son of God, quoting from the Gospels. So there's a teaching element to the painting. It's also, one of the things that Luther was cautious about was something that would be evoking an emotional response, as though that it would make someone think they needed to do something in order to receive God's grace. So his idea was you have something kind of still, which isn't playing on your emotions, so that you can take it in a spiritual way. So this is another Cranach. And again, it's especially striking when you go back and now compare it to 30 years before. Okay, now within the Catholic world, in the late 1500s, things, the Renaissance period doesn't last that long before people start to go in another direction. And El Greco is the most striking of them. In many ways, it seems almost like a 20th century artist. And he, after kind of all this work to kind of figure out how do you depict the body naturalistically and and all that, El Greco says, okay, I'm going to do it more expressionistically. And so he's stretched out the body. He combines naturalism with kind of irrealism to use color. Notably, El Greco began as an icon painter. And after learning how to paint icons, he ends up in the Latin West, and that's why he's El Greco, the Greek, and then kind of takes that icon background, so that, and bringing that sensibility into the way he depicts religious imagery, especially here the Crucifixion. But really, idiosyncratic and different. He likes to emphasize the color. He'll stretch bodies if it accomplishes the effect he wants. But it's definitely not keeping in that kind of excessively bloody tradition. This is another figure. This is Carracci, around late 1500s. So it's Renaissance, but there's a little bit more playing with the light, with the color, emphasize the dramatic, and then this leads into the Baroque. Okay, wait, actually I didn't. That's a mistake. Where am I? Okay, this is Rubens, a Flemish artist. So now what's shifting is there's an emphasis on drama, using light and dark, trying to emphasize the drama of the moment. This is raising of the cross. So I'm going to go kind of quickly, and partly because a lot of these crucifixes look the same. This is Van Dyck. What if I was Rubens, but it's Van Dyck? This is kind of a throwback. Even while there's this trend, this is another Dutch painter, Te Bruggen, which is more a kind of a combination of the blood side and a kind of a simpler style. Same time period, but different style. But the bulk of it is going in this direction. This is, now we're going to Spain. This is Zurbaran. Also very kind of realistic, dramatic. Just Christ on the cross, nobody else. This is Murillo. And then perhaps the best of this genre, Velázquez. These are some French kind of spin-off painters, not in the same category as the other ones, but who bring that style to France. But as this kind of image, just focusing on Christ in this kind of realistic context, this is new. This is Rembrandt. Now Rembrandt is working in a Calvinist country, and he was unusual in the amount of biblical subjects that he would do. But even so, when he does the Calvinist tradition, even though they would allow some biblical depictions, at least at this time, in the mid-1600s, still there was wariness of anything that could become idolatrous or somehow going beyond due artistic fittingness. So, it's kind of a narrative moment. It's not something that engages you like an icon engages you. Like those others, like these ones, are meant to engage you. These are, whether they succeed or not, they're meant to kind of engage you in a spiritual way. Whereas those are more narrative. Okay. Now, one way to think about modern depictions of the Crucifixion, you'll have many continuations of the different things we've seen. The Byzantine version of the crucifix, that was started in the 9th century. You can go into an icon store today somewhere and buy someone who painted something just like that. Many of the other ones you can find contemporary representations of those earlier styles. But starting in the 1800s, you start to see people kind of shaking things up in addition to all that are kind of taking a different perspective on the crucifix. This is William Blake, who's has a very known for having a very kind of idiosyncratic approach to Christianity and also to art. That he had a deliberately naive kind of style for his depictions. This is actually an illustration from Milton's Paradise Lost. He illustrated various books. This is Goya. Now, one thing to also see is more of a deliberate Christological reference in art. So this is Goya as well, depicting a historical event when innocents were killed, and he is the person in the center who deliberately is supposed to be a Christ figure. All the light comes to him. There's a kind of circular way in which the light, makes your eye keep going back to him. His arms in a crucifixion pose. This is Delacroix, French artist, starting to move into what we associate with Impressionism. Another Delacroix. And then you also have kind of more a move towards very kind of brutally naturalistic. This was done by an American artist, Eakins, I think. And he was not religious. And this, I think, is his only crucifixion, maybe his only Christian image. But perhaps because he thought, hey, I'm an artist, I should do a crucifixion. And he did this, it's deliberately just meant to be kind of brutal and naturalistic and not be trying to convey any kind of theological approach, not trying to engage the viewer. This is a Russian artist, Nikolai Gay, or G-E, however you pronounce that, early 1900s. Again, just kind of brutally naturalistic. Now this is an interesting figure. James Tissot, Jacques Tissot, but he spent a lot of time in England. Very interesting person. He kind of made his name painting portraits of wealthy French ladies and also British ladies. And then he had this religious conversion. Something happened. And he went to the Middle East because he wanted to be able to depict biblical scenes. So he went to the Middle East, he spent years there, brought his paints, painted there, and then came back to Paris in the mid-1890s and exhibited 120 plus paintings of different scenes, which was a huge success. And so he has a number of images related to the Passion. So here's one which he calls my God, why have you forsaken me? Each little different moments, each one. This one, a unique one. It's titled "What Jesus Saw from the Cross." So it's as though we depict it from Jesus' perspective.
Who's the painter?
Tissot, Tissot. This one I found really striking. Its title is "It is Accomplished." The last words of Jesus in John's Gospel. So here are, the few followers who are at the foot of the cross. Up the top, this is a Star of David and the divine name, Yahweh. And then various Jewish prophets holding up scrolls in exaltation as he brings to fulfillment Jewish prophecy. This is Marc Chagall, Jewish painter, who painted this white crucifixion in 1938. And he painted it I think at that point he was already in the United States. And he painted this to draw attention to the plight of European Jews. And connecting what happened, he painted a number of crucifixions, although he was Jewish, and connecting Jesus to the plight of his fellow Jews at the time. This is Georges Rouault. See again, I've been showing you, things that are kind of breaking the mold, kind of looking at the crucifixion from a different perspective. Georges Rouault was a French Catholic painter who, like Tissot, had a kind of dramatic conversion and shifted his painting style. He used to be very realistic, and then he became like this. Now this is a little flashback. This was done in the 1500s by a Spanish mystic, St. John of the Cross, who's also one of the national poets of Spain, who's just known for his Spanish poetry. And he, at one point, maybe he had a vision or something, he drew this image of the cross, a unique image, looking down from a strange angle at the top of the crucifixion. And it's a very small little, it's like, tiny little image, but very famous. And it inspired Salvador Dali to paint this image, of which he called the Crucifixion of St. John of the Cross. And with a similar kind of top perspective and with the cross positioned over the bottom. Okay, so I'll stop.
I think this is the best depiction of the crucifix. It's rather like God the Father looking down at his Son, saying that this is my beloved Son. See what you're doing this to him, causing him his death.
This crucifix, when it was first done, people didn't like it, and Glasgow was thinking of buying it, and they bought it, and the people thought it was terrible. They were upset. The museum spent all this money, and it became one of their greatest attractions. Now, I'll stop there. There's a few more, but just to kind of wrap things up. So, what I hope you saw in this is how, for all the power of the symbol of a God-man crucified, and for all of the kind of the centrality of it to Christianity, it's been interpreted in a variety of different ways, emphasizing different things, some emphasizing Christ's divinity, some emphasizing his suffering, some emphasizing his kind of the connection of his suffering with human suffering. Number of different perspectives. And when you see different crucifixes, you can, connect it with different theologies and often different periods of time in Christian history. Okay, so I'll stop there and take a break if you want to leave, and then if people have questions, I'll stick around for a little bit as well.